Long before he became known as the Liberator, Simón Bolívar was just a boy growing up in Caracas. He was born on July 24, 1783. At that time, Caracas was part of the Spanish Empire. The city was beautiful, but beneath that beauty was a society divided by birth, wealth, and power. Some people were born to rule. Others were born to obey. And young Bolivar was growing up inside that world. He had no idea yet that one day he would challenge the empire that controlled it. Bolivar was born into one of the wealthiest families in colonial Venezuela. His family owned large estates and belonged to the Creole elite. They had money. They had influence. They had a respected name. From the outside, his future seemed almost guaranteed. But wealth could not protect him from tragedy. His father died when Bolivar was still very young. Then, when he was only 9 years old, he lost his mother as well. Suddenly, the boy who had been surrounded by family was left without his parents. After becoming an orphan, Bolivar was passed between relatives and guardians. But one person remained especially important during his childhood. Her name was Hipólita. She was an enslaved woman who had cared for Bolivar from infancy. To him, she was far more than a servant. She was someone who had helped raise him when his own parents were gone. And as Bolivar grew older, he began to understand something uncomfortable. The world around him was built on a system where some people were given freedom while others were denied it. He had been born into privilege, but he was beginning to question what privilege really meant. His education would soon become just as important as his family background. Bolivar was taught by several influential figures, but one teacher would leave a deeper mark than the others. His name was Simón Rodriguez. Rodriguez was not interested in simply teaching Bolivar how to behave like a wealthy young man. He wanted him to think, to question, to look beyond the world he had inherited. He introduced Bolivar to new ideas about freedom, society, and government. And slowly, the boy began to see his world differently. The ideas of the Enlightenment were spreading across the Atlantic. People were questioning old systems. They were asking whether kings should have absolute power. They were asking whether people should have a voice in their own government. Revolutions were already changing the world. The American Revolution had challenged British rule. France was moving toward its own great upheaval. And these events were being watched from far away. For Bolivar, they were more than stories. They were proof that the world could change. But Bolivar was still young. He had not become a soldier. He had not led an army. He had not stood before a crowd demanding independence. He was simply a young man trying to understand the world around him. Then, another journey changed everything. As a young adult, Bolivar traveled to Europe. And there, he encountered a world far larger than the one he had known in Caracas. He saw different governments, different societies, different ways of thinking, and every experience added another piece to the person he was becoming. Europe was also witnessing extraordinary change. Revolutionary ideas were spreading. Old traditions were being challenged. And then Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in France. Bolivar watched the events around him closely. The world was proving that power was not always permanent. Kings could lose their thrones. Empires could be challenged. and ordinary people could become part of history. For someone like Bolivar, those lessons were impossible to ignore. But there was something else waiting for him. A personal loss. Bolivar had married Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro in Spain. He returned with her to Venezuela, hoping to begin a new life. But that happiness would not last. His wife died only months after their marriage. Bolivar was devastated. The future he had imagined suddenly disappeared. Once again, death had taken someone he loved. And once again, he was forced to face a life he had never planned for. After Maria Teresa's death, Bolivar returned to Europe. He was no longer simply the young man who had left Caracas years earlier. He had experienced wealth, education, love, loss, and political change. Now, his attention turned towards something much bigger, the future of his homeland. Why should a distant empire control the lives of people thousands of miles away? Why should birth determine a person's place in society? And if the world could change elsewhere, why couldn't it change in Venezuela? In Ibalinwool, Bolivar stood on a hill overlooking Rome with his mentor Simón Rodriguez. He was still young. He had no army behind him, no throne, no nation waiting to follow him. But he was beginning to believe that his life had a purpose. He looked at the world differently now. The old order was not invincible. Empires could fall. People could rise. And somewhere across the ocean, his homeland was still living under Spanish rule. Bolivar did not know exactly how the future would unfold. But one thing was becoming clear. He would not spend the rest of his life simply watching history happen. He was going to become part of it. And when he finally returned to Venezuela, the quiet young man who had once lost everything would discover a country waiting for someone brave enough to challenge an empire. When Bolivar returned to Venezuela, he was no longer the same young man who had left years earlier. He had seen Europe. He had witnessed revolutions. He had watched old ideas of power begin to collapse. And now he looked at Venezuela with different eyes. The country was still under Spanish rule. The people were divided by social class, and political power remained firmly in the hands of the Spanish crown. But something had changed inside Bolivar. He no longer believed that the old system had to last forever. Then, in 1808, Europe was thrown into chaos. Napoleon invaded Spain. The Spanish monarchy was shaken, and suddenly, the empire that had ruled Venezuela for generations was facing a crisis of its own. Thousands of miles away, people in Venezuela began asking an important question. If Spain itself was struggling, who had the right to govern its colonies? The answer was far from simple. And for Bolivar, the opportunity he had been waiting for was finally beginning to appear. In 1810, the crisis reached Venezuela. Political leaders in Caracas created a new governing body. They claimed to be acting in the name of the imprisoned Spanish king. But beneath those words was something much more dangerous. The idea that Venezuela could govern itself. Bolivar immediately supported the movement. He was no longer standing on the sidelines. He entered politics. He spoke openly about independence. And he began pushing the country toward a decision that could change everything. Bolivar was sent on a mission to Britain. His goal was to seek support for Venezuela, but he also saw something important there. Britain had its own interests. It did not want Spain to regain complete control of the region. Bolivar returned with limited support, but he brought something far more valuable with him: confidence. He now believed that Venezuela had a real chance to break away. The question was whether the people were ready to take that chance. Then came July 5, 1811. Venezuela declared independence. For Bolivar, it was the moment everything had been building toward. The country was finally choosing its own future. But declaring independence was one thing. Defending it was another. Spain had not simply disappeared. Royalist forces remained powerful, and the new Venezuelan government had very little experience fighting a war. The dream had begun. Now it had to survive. Bolivar entered the military struggle. But the first attempt at independence quickly began to collapse. The new republic was divided. Its leaders disagreed. Its army lacked experience, and royalist forces were gathering strength. Then disaster struck. A powerful earthquake devastated Caracas and other parts of Venezuela. Thousands of people died. Buildings collapsed. The young republic was thrown into chaos, and many people began to believe that independence itself had brought disaster. The situation became even worse. Royalist forces pushed forward. The Venezuelan army struggled to stop them. Eventually, the First Republic collapsed. Bolivar was forced to flee. The dream he had fought for was disappearing before his eyes. He had believed independence could be achieved quickly. Now he was learning the hardest lesson of all. Freedom could be declared in a single day, but winning it could take years. Bolivar escaped to New Granada. He could have disappeared. He could have returned to a quiet life. He still had wealth. He still had connections. He could have chosen safety. Instead, he began planning again. He studied what had gone wrong. He realized that simply defeating Spanish soldiers would not be enough. The revolution needed organization. It needed discipline. And above all, it needed people willing to keep fighting after the first defeat. Bolivar was beginning to understand what kind of leader he needed to become. In 1812, he wrote a powerful political document known as the Cartagena Manifesto. He explained why the first Venezuelan republic had failed. Weak government, political division, poor military organization, a lack of unity. Bolivar believed these mistakes could not be repeated. If Venezuela wanted freedom, the revolution needed stronger leadership, and Bolivar was prepared to take that responsibility. He gathered supporters. He gathered soldiers. Then he prepared to return. In Sen, Bolivar launched a campaign that would change his reputation forever. He marched toward Venezuela. His forces were still small. His resources were limited. But this time, he moved with determination. Town after town began falling into his hands. Supporters joined his army, and as he advanced, people began giving him a new name, El Libertador, the Liberator. But Bolivar had not yet won his country. The war was only beginning, and waiting ahead was an enemy far stronger than anything he had faced before. The name began spreading across Venezuela. El Libertador, the Liberator. But Bolivar knew the title meant nothing if he could not hold what he had won. His campaign had pushed royalist forces back. Cities had welcomed his army. For a moment, independence seemed close. But Spain was not ready to surrender. Royalist commanders began gathering new forces, and Bolivar soon discovered that taking a city was easier than keeping a country united. The fighting became brutal. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Villages were caught between armies. Families were divided. People who had once lived together now found themselves fighting against one another. Bolivar responded with a policy that showed how far the war had changed him. He declared that those who continued fighting for Spanish rule would face severe consequences. It was a harsh decision, but Bolivar believed the revolution could not survive if its enemies were allowed to destroy it from within. For a time, Bolivar seemed unstoppable. His army captured important cities. His reputation grew. More soldiers joined him. More people began believing that Spanish rule could actually be defeated. But victory created a new problem. The revolution was not united behind one vision. Different leaders wanted different futures. Some wanted complete independence. Others wanted limited autonomy. Some feared Bolivar's growing power. The struggle for freedom was becoming a struggle over what freedom itself would mean. Then the tide turned. Royalist forces regrouped. They found new support among people who feared the revolutionary movement. Bolivar's army began losing ground. The campaign that had once seemed unstoppable started to collapse. By the end of 1814, the Second Republic of Venezuela had fallen. Again, Bolivar had failed to secure independence. Again, and this time, the defeat was even more painful. He left Venezuela once more. But Bolivar was no longer the inexperienced young man who had entered the revolution years earlier. He had learned from defeat. He understood the weaknesses of his movement. He understood that independence could not belong only to wealthy elites. If ordinary people were going to fight for freedom, they needed a reason to believe the new society would belong to them too. That realization would change the way Bolivar approached the revolution. Bolivar eventually reached Haiti. The young republic had been born from its own revolution against slavery and French colonial rule. Its president, Alexandre Pétion, offered Bolivar support, weapons, supplies, and a place to rebuild. But Pétion asked for something in return. If Bolivar succeeded, he would help end slavery in the lands he liberated. Bolivar agreed. For the first time, the revolution was becoming something larger than simply removing Spain. It was becoming a fight over the kind of society that would come afterward. In Chen Bai Bai Ishulu, Bolivar returned to the struggle. This time, he understood that victory would require more than courage. He needed allies. He needed soldiers from different backgrounds. And he needed to convince people that independence could give them something worth fighting for. His forces landed on the Venezuelan coast. The campaign was difficult. There were setbacks. There were disagreements. But Bolivar refused to stop. Every defeat became another lesson. Every retreat became another chance to rebuild. Then Bolivar changed his strategy. Instead of trying to conquer every stronghold immediately, he focused on building a stronger base of support. He worked to unite different factions. He promised a future beyond Spanish rule. And gradually, His movement grew. The revolution was no longer a small rebellion. It was becoming a national struggle. But Bolivar knew Venezuela alone might not be enough. Spain could send more troops, more weapons, more armies. If the revolution was going to survive, it needed to strike somewhere the Spanish least expected. Bolivar turned his attention toward New Granada. The Spanish controlled much of the region, but Bolivar saw an opportunity. If he could liberate New Granada, he could gain access to enormous resources, more soldiers, more territory, and a stronger position against Spain. The plan was incredibly dangerous. His army would have to cross some of the most difficult terrain in the region. Mountains, cold, mud, thin air, and roads that barely deserved to be called roads. But Bolivar had made his decision. In 1819, the army began its march across the Andes. The soldiers climbed higher and higher. The weather became colder. Some became sick. Others could barely continue. Horses died. Supplies disappeared. But Bolivar kept moving. He knew that the Spanish forces were not expecting an army to appear from that direction. If the crossing succeeded, the entire war could change. The soldiers had no idea whether they would survive the journey. But they continued forward, because on the other side of those mountains was a battlefield. And waiting there was the opportunity Bolivar had been searching for since the first revolution failed. The army continued climbing through the Andes. The higher they went, the colder the air became. The soldiers were exhausted. Some had lost their horses. Others were struggling to carry their weapons through the mountains. But there was no turning back. Bolivar knew the Spanish forces were not expecting an attack from this direction. If his army could cross the mountains, they could reach New Granada before the enemy was ready. So they kept moving, one frozen step at a time. The journey became a battle of its own. The soldiers crossed narrow paths above steep valleys. Rain soaked their clothes. Cold winds cut through their bodies. Many had little food. Some soldiers became too weak to continue. Others fell behind and disappeared into the mountains. Yet Bolivar continued with the army. He understood that the hardships were costing them men, but stopping now could mean losing everything. Their only hope was to reach the other side before the Spanish army could prepare. Eventually, the army descended from the mountains. The soldiers were exhausted, but they had achieved something the Spanish commanders never expected. Bolivar had brought his army into New Granada. Now the element of surprise belonged to him. The Spanish forces rushed to respond. They were stronger in numbers. They knew the territory, and they believed they could still crush the revolution. But Bolivar had already decided where he would strike. The two armies finally met near the Boyacá River. The Spanish forces were caught off guard. Bolivar's soldiers attacked with everything they had left. The battle was fierce, but it did not last long. The Spanish army was overwhelmed. Their lines broke. Many soldiers surrendered, and the road to Bogotá was suddenly open. For Bolivar, this was more than another battlefield victory. It was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Bolivar's army entered Bogotá. The Spanish authorities fled. The city was now in revolutionary hands. After years of defeats, exile, and uncertainty, Bolivar had finally achieved something enormous. He had liberated a major part of New Granada, and the victory gave the revolution something it had desperately needed: resources, soldiers, money, and confidence. The movement was no longer fighting simply to survive. It was becoming powerful enough to challenge Spanish rule across an entire region. But Bolivar was thinking beyond New Granada. He wanted to unite the liberated territories into something greater: a single republic, a nation strong enough to defend itself from foreign powers and internal division. In 1819, the idea of Gran Colombia was formally established. It brought together territories that would eventually become Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. To Bolivar, this was the future: a united South America. But creating a country on paper was much easier than keeping its people united. Bolivar returned his attention to Venezuela. The Spanish still controlled large parts of the country, and the war was far from over. This time, however, Bolivar had a stronger army behind him. He had gained experience. He had gained allies, and he had gained something even more important: momentum. The revolution was no longer a desperate dream. It was becoming a force that Spain could no longer ignore. The fighting continued. Bolivar and his commanders pushed the royalists back. One victory followed another, but every victory came with a price. Soldiers died. Cities were damaged. Families were separated. The war had already lasted for years, and there was still no guarantee that independence would survive. Bolivar knew that one final victory could change everything. But he also knew that Spain would fight to keep its empire. Then came the Battle of Carabobo in 1821. Bolivar's forces faced the Spanish army in Venezuela. This was no longer a small rebellion. It was a battle for the future of the country. Bolivar positioned his forces carefully. The fighting began. His soldiers attacked the Spanish lines. The Royalist army struggled to hold its position. Then their formation began to break. The Spanish forces retreated. And, with that defeat, Spanish control over Venezuela was effectively shattered. Bolivar had finally returned to the land where his dream had begun. Years earlier, he had been a young man questioning the world around him. Then he had become a revolutionary, a fugitive, an exile, a defeated commander. And now he stood among the victors. Venezuela was moving toward independence, but Bolivar's dream was much bigger than one country. He wanted to free an entire continent. And beyond Venezuela, other territories were still waiting. The war was not finished. In fact, the greatest part of Bolivar's journey was only beginning. Venezuela was no longer under Spain's complete control. But Bolivar refused to stop there. Beyond Venezuela, vast territories were still ruled by the Spanish, and Bolivar believed that as long as Spain remained powerful in South America, the freedom they had won would never be completely safe. His vision was growing. He no longer wanted to liberate one country. He wanted to help free an entire continent. But achieving that dream would require another army, another campaign, and another impossible journey. Bolivar turned his attention toward Ecuador. The Spanish still controlled the region. Their armies were experienced. Their defenses were strong, but Bolivar had something they could not easily match: a growing revolutionary movement. His forces moved south, while other commanders fought the Spanish from different directions. The campaign became part of a much larger struggle. Every victory weakened Spain's position. Every liberated territory gave the revolution more strength. And slowly, the Spanish Empire was being pushed back. Then came one of the most important figures in Bolivar's struggle, Antonio José de Sucre. Sucre was a talented young commander who had earned Bolivar's trust. Together, they planned the campaign to liberate Quito. The Spanish forces were waiting. They knew the coming battle could decide the fate of Ecuador. But Sucre moved his army through difficult terrain. He climbed toward the highlands. And in May 1822, the armies met near the slopes of Pichincha. The Battle of Pichincha was fought at high altitude. The terrain was difficult. The soldiers struggled to move, but Sucre's forces kept advancing. The fighting became intense. Eventually, the Spanish army was defeated. Quito was liberated. Another major territory had broken away from Spanish rule. And once again, Bolivar's dream was becoming reality. But the victory also revealed something important. South America's liberation was no longer the work of one man. It was being carried by many commanders and thousands of soldiers. Bolivar and Sucre now looked farther south. Peru remained one of Spain's strongest positions in South America. As long as Spanish power remained there, the war could continue. So Bolivar prepared for another campaign. But this time, he would not be fighting alone. Another great revolutionary leader had already entered Peru. In Ibarra, Bolivar met San Martin in Guayaquil. The meeting was private. What exactly the two men discussed remains partly uncertain. But one thing became clear. San Martin eventually stepped away from the campaign. Bolivar was now left to continue the fight for Peru. It was a huge responsibility. The final stages of the war would depend heavily on his leadership. And Bolivar understood that failure here could give Spain another chance to recover. Bolivar entered Peru and began reorganizing the revolutionary forces. The country was exhausted by years of conflict. Political divisions remained. The Spanish still had powerful armies. But Bolivar had learned from every defeat he had suffered. He knew that patience mattered. He knew that discipline mattered. And he knew that a final victory required more than courage. It required perfect timing. That moment finally came in 1824. At Junin, Bolivar's forces faced the Spanish army. The battle was fought mostly with cavalry. The fighting was fast and brutal. But Bolivar's army gained the advantage. The Spanish forces were pushed back. It was another important victory. Yet Bolivar knew the war was not finished. The final confrontation would come later that year, and this time the responsibility would fall heavily on Sucre. On December 9, 1824, the armies met at Ayacucho. Sucre commanded the revolutionary forces. Across the battlefield stood the Spanish army. For centuries, Spain had controlled much of South America. Now its power was about to face its greatest challenge. The battle began. The revolutionary forces attacked. The Spanish lines weakened, and eventually the Royalist army surrendered. Ayacucho became the decisive victory of the independence struggle. Spanish military power in South America had been broken. The war that had begun years earlier was finally reaching its end. Bolivar had survived defeat, exile, loss, civil war, and impossible marches through mountains. He had helped liberate Venezuela, New Granada, Ecuador, and Peru. His dream had become something real. But victory created a new question. How would these newly liberated nations live together? Bolivar wanted them united, but the people who had fought beside him did not always agree. Political rivalries were growing, regional interests were clashing, and Bolivar was about to discover that defeating an empire could be easier than building a nation.